I really don't like this trend of people saying that new Pokemon games are too easy compared to the old ones. That you hear a lot of things like, oh, the EXP share ruined all the 3DS Pokemon games, and that Game Freak is only making Pokemon for kids now, so they're just making it intentionally easier. But really, when you break down those arguments, they don't hold up, and this video was actually inspired by a recent tweet from Joe Merrick. This is the team I used to get through Crystal. Remember when people complained that the recent games have been too easy? No grinding, only one major issue in Azalea Town, which required items, missed a good chunk of trainers, and we can see right there that his strongest Pokemon is a level 60 Typhlosion, and the rest of the team is really weak and just looks like wild-caught HM slaves, the Gyarados, and then Pokemon that received almost no experience. Because one thing you could do in those earlier Pokemon games was just solo YOLO with your starter Pokemon and pretty much just beat the game with them. So that brings us to the Virtual Console, which is a really good discussion point about this video, because now we can directly compare the newest Pokemon games to the oldest Pokemon games. That there are no accessibility issues now, because all you have to do is pay $10 and then you can download the original Pokemon games from the Nintendo eShop, and they are completely intact and they are the same experience. So we can kind of see what's going on right there, and my first impressions are, yeah, new Pokemon games don't really feel that much easier. If anything, for a couple of different reasons, they're balanced in different ways. Like, the AI is going to be much more complex. Remember how you could beat Lance's Dragonite by having a Poison-type Pokemon because it'll spam agility? That's what we were dealing with back in the early generations. I'm not calling it a fault of the first generation games, but in that time, Game Freak has grown and then understood more about Pokemon battling to actually give us a bit more of a challenge along the way, and the newer Pokemon games are no exception to that. So that's something. However, with the wider access of moves, we're actually going to be able to get stronger, more powerful moves on a wider variety of Pokemon instead of like using these dumb moves in the first generation games that really aren't optimal. So yeah, we can more easily optimize. So yeah, we can optimize our Pokemon better in the newer generation games compared to the older ones, but I really don't think that that makes as much of a difference as people say, because it's all about information. It's all about knowledge. When it comes to new players, they aren't going to have any understanding of this. They're not going to know how to most optimally play the Pokemon, and unless they talk to every NPC like we did back in the day to kind of slowly gain this game knowledge of making the best decisions, you're still going to find many players that are like, oh, Lick is a ghost type move, that sounds pretty cool, I'm still going to run that on my Frogadier even though it's a physical move, not special, and I don't gain any kind of stab from it. So there's going to be a lot of things that make the game challenging, but it's because of personal decisions, and I think that that kind of shows the biggest thing here, is that it's an information bridge. That my first time playing through Blue version was much more difficult than my second time, or my Virtual Console time, or any of these other playthroughs, because I have the game knowledge. By the time the 4th generation rolled around, I was already just crushing games because I put a lot of time into Pokemon, I started to understand it, and then I did the outside research. I looked up what stab meant, and I figured out all these other little optimizations inside the game, and it's like, oh, I was just using terrible moves the entire time, I didn't know what to expect. But eventually, you start to understand what to expect when it comes to Pokemon. Now, making the new Pokemon games harder to like offset this, to compensate for that, would just be unfair to new Pokemon players because they still have no understanding. So what it means is that you're getting good at Pokemon, but the games aren't necessarily becoming easier. For example, I was thinking about my first Soul Silver playthrough, and it reminds me a lot of what Joe Merrick did to just absolutely crush the game. That I did not have a single Pokemon over level 40, and I was still able to beat Champion Lance. The game is almost 8 years old at this point, and I still already had enough of an understanding to figure out how to cheese the game. I had a level 38 Gyarados. Cool thing about Gyarados is that it gets Ice Fang, and Lance is really weak to Ice Fang, so I was able to have a very low level Gyarados and able to do very well against him. I had like a level 38 Ampharos. Ampharos, because of the 4th generation and abilities having play in that, it has static. So my idea was I would throw Ampharos out there to tank, put static on an opposing Pokemon, and then I was going to be faster, and that's where my level 40 Haunter came in. Just outspeed, do some damage, and clean up against most of the Elite Four. Like, this wasn't even the levels of my Pokemon going into the Elite Four. I think I might have failed once, but then you gain that experience, and then you just rush through it anyways. As for my Lugia was on my Pokewalker, because Lugia is my favorite Pokemon. I'd rather carry Lugia around school than, you know, worry about bouncing back and forth. I was too lazy. I slapped Lugia on there, and I was like, you know what, Lugia's with me forever. And my starter Pokemon, Typhlosion, I actually gave that to my girlfriend at the time to put onto her Pokewalker, and everything was good. So I didn't even have my high base stat starter Pokemon or my freebie legendary Pokemon, and when you think about it, legendary Pokemon just being a thing make the game super easy to begin with because you just funnel everything onto them. It doesn't matter if EXP share is turned on or off, everything goes on legendary Pokemon, you stock up revives, you get full restores, and then you can clear the game as needed. So I think that Pokemon, as we get into this more modern age of Pokemon, it more develops into the expectation of the post-game instead of the challenge of the actual game itself. That, you know, for the last couple of Pokemon games, I think since I actually can't even remember the last time, maybe 3rd generation, you know, was the last time I played a Pokemon game where I just went to beat Pokemon. But now it's like, alright, I can't wait to get to the end and then unlock the world of Pokemon, train a team, do competitive battling and stuff like that. And back in the 4th generation, I think that was a big era of discovery, that people were really starting to get into competitive play, into what else Pokemon has to offer, instead of just playing the game and then talking about it with friends at school. I think that that's one thing that we've seen, especially going into the 3DS era. 3DS era has a lot more support online, that YouTubing really blew up for 3DS, that there's so many guides, there's a lot more information, more people are talking about it, it's a lot more social, so you can actually get through the game with more information now than you did previously, which makes the game feel easier, even though it really isn't that easier. And I don't understand where the EXP share argument comes in to begin with, because one, you can turn it off, or 2, you're already going to have, like, your starter Pokemon. So we take your starter Pokemon, and he's going to be the one that carries you through most of the game anyways. That's just because of the way the starter Pokemon are built. They have better typings than the Pokemon you're going to encounter early on in the game. You're not going to have, like, a bug type or a normal type or something really basic early on in the game. And then you have higher base stats with better offensive distribution, and then you're able to use stab with that, so you're doing more damage, like bonus damage on top of better stats, and then that Pokemon is going to gain tons of experience. And starter Pokemon just tend to take these natural advantages and snowball them super hard because they're the strongest Pokemon that you have to begin with. Level 5 compared to like level 2, 3, and maybe 4 wild Pokemon, but after you beat your rival, you're gaining free levels right there, and before you know it, you're already like doubling the level of the wild Pokemon. You're using your starter Pokemon to farm most of the trainers on a route, giving you even further enhanced experience, and then they just take off from there to the point where I think the EXP share can technically be seen as a way of maybe making the game easier, but not because like, oh, all my Pokemon are too strong now, but because your team actually has diversity. But even with that, it's not going to change the end result at all, that you're going to have a really strong starter Pokemon, and at some point you're gaining a legendary that's also going to start beating everything down as well, because the difficulty in Pokemon isn't really about the level of your Pokemon, but the challenges that you have to overcome, and you're going to do that regardless if you have a stronger supporting team or not. That if you can't figure out an opponent's weakness, yeah, you're going to have a little bit of time, you need to fall back and kind of figure that one out, but I don't think the EXP share gives you any of that, because it takes no difficulty, you know, there's no effort in falling back to a route and then farming Pokemon until you're a higher level. Yes, you can do that to compensate for your weaknesses, but overall, if you're still finding challenge, that's mostly just from game understanding like I was talking about earlier. So really all I see with the EXP share is that instead of having 3 Graveler that you caught on Victory Road to use as revive fodder for your super strong starter Pokemon if something goes wrong, you now have the Graveler that you caught on Victory Road and then 2 cool Pokemon that you were able to carry from the earlier routes. I think it's actually really nice because in 6th generation, you know, there's some really cool Pokemon that you find early on in the game, but they start to drop off super hard, and unless you want to put that time into them to, you know, just kind of keep them at an acceptable level, you're going to be just using your starter Pokemon anyways. And also, the EXP share only gives 50% experience, so it's not like they're going to be as strong as your strongest Pokemon anyways. They're going to kind of fall off just a little bit, but they might have slightly more use, and I don't think that that makes the game much easier. And even when you go outside of the EXP share, the argument that Pokemon games have gotten easier still doesn't really look that strong. This is Lance. Say hi to Lance. He's the Johto League champion. His strongest Pokemon is a level 50. This is Diantha. Her strongest Pokemon is almost level 70, and it's a Mega Gardevoir. So, I mean, we can see that there's a discrepancy right here, and I'm not using this as an example to say, oh, the Pokemon games are harder because the Pokemon are higher level for the champion. That there's a lot of things that change throughout the course of the gameplay that kind of create this discrepancy that we see, but it shows that whatever has changed in Pokemon has also adapted. That if the Pokemon games have gotten easier in some way, that's offset by having higher level trainers near the end. So something is happening to where the game has a larger challenge and a greater scale, and just because you understand the game better doesn't really mean that that makes the game necessarily easier. People might counter this by saying, well, you still have to battle the Kanto side when it comes to the second generation games, and that the rematch for Lance is really challenging, but I don't really see much of a difference because there's other rematches in other Pokemon games where the battles get harder as well. I think that the Kanto side of the second generation games is more or less the post game. That you have a lot of freedom to do whatever you want, that there's a lot of higher level trainers and a lot of higher level gym leaders, so you're not going to have too much of a challenge getting your Pokemon to compete on that level, and there really wasn't too much that was difficult about that as well. That if you know the gym leader layout, you can actually play to your type advantages, snowball experience, and then next thing you know, you're at that Lance rematch, and it's not going to be the worst thing ever, and also you've already farmed up enough money to where you can compensate for anything by having full restores and revives as always. Now Red, that's a different story because that's just one of the most intentionally challenging battles in Pokemon. Imagine that if at the battle tree you were greeted with Red and all of his Pokemon were over level 80. It's just pretty much where Game Freak decided to make the gate. They wanted the battle tree to be accessible to more people than finishing the game at Mount Silver because there was nothing else to do back in the second generation. All of your time, those extra hours and hours and hours of dedication, that was all to build up to beating Red and then saying that you have completed, you have conquered this game. But now in modern Pokemon, there's the post game, there's competitive, there's a lot else to do, so Game Freak isn't trying to like put this insane wall in your way, and I don't think that's really difficulty based in the game being too easy. That you're still going to have to spend hundreds of hours to train competitive Pokemon if you want to take it to the next level and actually be a competitive battler, so the time, you know, it's just different times for different things in a different era of Pokemon. Something else that's interesting to talk about are the level differences between gym leaders and wild Pokemon in some of the earlier Pokemon games. Some people might take this and say, oh, look at that, the level differences make the game so much harder, but it also ignores a lot of the things that are happening in the game as well. That we take Price. Price, he's got level 30s. Wild Pokemon, they're not even over level 20, but until this point, you've generally had Pokemon on your team. Like, look at that. We have Pidgeotto, Noctowl, Mareep, and Flaffy. Well, you've already had opportunities to capture these Pokemon anyways, so if you wanted them, you could have already captured them and then have them at a higher level naturally on your team. And that also ignores the Team Rocket takedown. That you have to actually fight through Team Rocket and tons of grunts, tons of experience earning opportunities up until that point. So you're actually going to be more on par with Price's level by the time you get through there. Starting off with a initially caught wild Pokemon and working your way up, that's going to be a problem, yes, but I don't really see too much of a difference. Also, there's this thing known as experience. Experience has very exponential scaling in Pokemon, so the difference between level 20s and level 30s isn't going to be as challenging as a difference between a level 40 and a level 50 Pokemon, which is actually what we see in the 6th generation. So Wolfric, look at that, he's got over level 50s, almost a level 60, but the wild Pokemon, those are ridiculously overpowered as well. You can almost catch some of those and get ready to beat Lance back in the earlier Pokemon games, so showing that things have really shifted in the scale of the game, so you're playing with higher level Pokemon, you're fighting with them, but that's also going to create problems as well. So while the wild Pokemon are higher level, it's actually going to be harder to KO those wild Pokemon. That if you have a level 25 fighting a level 15, it's going to be easier to knock out that Pokemon than a level 50 fighting a level 45. So you're able to gain experience quicker in the Generation 2 example, and there's a lot less experience used in the 6th generation to actually catch up to the gym leaders there. I also want to do some calculations here. So the average experience of Pokemon caught at level 16 is going to be about 2,000. The average experience of a Pokemon caught at level, mid to high 40s, like level 47, is about 96,000. So to be able to match the gym leader, you are going to need to gain ridiculous amounts of experience, and when it breaks down, sure, it's like 100 battles for the Generation 2 example, and it's only going to be about 74 examples for the Generation 6 example, but remember, the 2nd generation battles are going to go faster, and you add a lot more trainer battles for the enhanced experience to get you there as well. So even at different stages of the game, while the differences might look vast, you can actually compensate for them pretty easily, and yes, while your overall team level is going to be averaged out high higher on the 6th and 7th generation Pokemon games, it's not going to really change that you're just beating them anyways. So you feel more comfortable, but again, it's not going to change the results too much. And then with the 5th generation, people praise as a game that has challenge, as a game that has difficulty. It's actually easier to catch a wild Pokemon and then gain experience to get ready for the gym leader. Drayden on normal mode, look at this right here, 47,000 to 89,000 at 700 experience per battle. So it's going to take fewer Pokemon battles in the 5th generation compared to the 2nd generation to actually catch up with whatever the average trainer or gym leader level is. I'm not counting challenge mode because challenge mode is not the default mode for the game. That when you play through normally, that's going to be what counts as the initial difficulty of Pokemon. Sure, you can modify it to create extra difficulty, but then that's just post-game where difficulty doesn't really matter, and that's just like, do you want to be a competitive battler, or do you just want to play through the game and create your own challenges? Like, okay, does that mean that everyone has to play a Nuzlocke to experience the ultimate in Pokemon difficulty? Not really. So I don't really see any change with the actual game design from almost all of the Pokemon games. You can find parts where some games have parts that are easier compared to other games, and overall, once you get good at Pokemon, you can still just roll through any Pokemon game. But I think that's it. A lot of people now, they're older, they're going to be more opinionated, and they're going to realize that Pokemon feels easier than it did when they were growing up. They don't have a new first-time Pokemon experience with these modern Pokemon games like other people do. Not to mention, I've met a lot of kids in my life that love Pokemon, whether it's a younger cousin, the neighbor's kid, or a family friend's son or something. They talk about it all the same. You know, the first couple Pokemon games are going to be tricky, they start to understand it, and then they get better at it, and then they learn about the game, and they find out if they want to take it to the next level, or if they just have appreciation for Pokemon instead of love. I don't understand why people have to say, like, Pokemon's getting worse, why Game Freak is changing and they're trying to make this game for kids. I mean, it's always been a kid's game, but if anything, from the 6th generation, 7th generation, they've done a lot more fan service to older Pokemon fans than we've seen in almost any other Pokemon game, so that should be respected instead of just met with scorn and this stupid logic of saying that Pokemon games have gotten too easy, when really, just play an old Pokemon game and try to cheese it. You'll accomplish that, and it's not Game Freak's fault. So if you guys enjoyed the video, hope you all have a nice day. Thank you very much for watching.